Welcome back, friends, to another episode of Liminal Frames. I'm your host, Nathan, and I'm joined by my friend and co-host, Darren King, also known as ExoAcademian. It's great to be back with all of you, back in the podcast chair with our Liminal Frames listeners. I've always wondered what we would call them, the Liminal Framites. There's got to be a cool name out there. Somebody, if you've got a name for what the audience might be called, please toss it our way. We'd love to hear it. Speaking of that, I love the audience feedback on the Galactic Federation Let's Go from last time. I think we should definitely keep workshopping that along with our future line of alien mummy gummies. So that's all part of the Liminal Frame store at some point in the future, perhaps. But it's great to be back on the show and catch up with you, Darren. I think it's been kind of a little bit of a lull period in terms of big breaking news items in the UFO community. But nevertheless, there's still things that are going on, and there are pieces that are being discussed that are important for us to dig a little bit more deeply into. And I know that you want to jump into some of that on the show today. Before we do that, though, I always like to check in with you. How are things going, and what's been on your mind lately?
Generally, I've just been enjoying some really rich, robust conversations with different groups around everything that's happening in the world, of which the UFO phenomenon is one of many things that are happening. As I mentioned on the recent POC episode, there seems to be this convergence of elements in our world, forces in our world, that are both daunting and compelling, suggesting that something is coming, that something is emerging from all of this, that there's really no way to see how it doesn't end up that way, hence why I titled the episode Nearing the Event Horizon. So I'm aware of that, and as you and I were discussing before we just started recording, while that's daunting to some people, on the other hand, the state of the world is challenging to such a degree right now that perhaps some massive shift is exactly what we need. So perhaps that's part of what's happening here. And other than that, just enjoying the fact that it's getting a little bit warmer every week. I've been out riding my Ninja, which is always fun. How about you? What's been going on with you?
Yeah, well, we joked about allergy season last show, and I have to tell you, I'm dealing with it already, and it's a little bit unsettling that it's happening so soon. It's kind of hit me a little bit like a ton of bricks. So every once in a while, if my voice gets a little dry or whatnot, it's really just because I'm struggling with the things that have decided to start blooming all of a sudden. And I love the spring, so I'm all about it. But I would like the winter to be winter a little bit longer. And it's possible. In March, we may see some real interesting winter weather activity. There's certainly a possibility for that. So we shall see, but it's going to look like it's going to be a pretty warm week ahead of us, at least in Western North Carolina. So looking forward to seeing where that goes. It's been a slow UFO sort of space for me. I've been, again, continuing to focus on my work, my day-to-day job, which has been busy this time of year. And it's frustrating in some sense and stressful in other senses, but it's also can be rewarding. I'm fortunate to have a job that I enjoy doing, and so been able to kind of focus in on that and get some really good things done there, which has taken me away from as much of a focus on the day-to-day UFO sound bites, although I do try to keep up with it and try to keep up with the key releases and videos and whatnot. So there's stuff to talk about and get into, but it's been, I don't know, it's that season of, I guess, quiet for me in the UFO world, and I think we all need that from time to time, just to take a little bit of a breather, check in with the rest of the stuff that's going on in your life, evaluate everything, and step away from UFOs for a bit, and make sure that you've got that space to just kind of be you in a wholesome, holistic way.
For sure. I think that is true. And I think that, as we talked about in our last episode, there's even something to say for the notion that you slowly expose people to this. As much as we see the UFO community championing, let's have disclosure yesterday already, maybe the more appropriate, responsible way to handle it is to slowly expose people to this so they can begin to prepare themselves. We, of course, know that people like Steve Bassett and Danny Sheehan have been on a tear talking about what's coming. And Steve Bassett, as we've discussed before, is often very optimistic that we're on the verge of a massive disclosure moment. I think Danny Sheehan, for both of us, is perhaps a little bit more reliable in terms of what he describes. And there was one interesting tidbit that came out in a recent long-form interview with Danny that caught both of our attention, where he said for the first time, I don't think anyone else had heard this being mentioned before, but we know that David Grush included allegations around biologics that had been recovered. There's questions about what that meant. But Danny basically said that the Senate Intelligence Committee has seen the genetic evidence proving that this is non-human. So that's a pretty remarkable turn of events. It certainly supports the Grush allegations with really strong empirical evidence. So that's interesting, and it suggests to me that things are much further along behind the scenes than we realize.
Yeah, I do wonder what wheels are turning in that space. You reminded me that recently there was a briefing given by Elizondo on the Hill with, I think it was a conservative interest group, but there were some sound bites that came out of that briefing that it seems like these lawmakers are continuing to be interested and focused, that the interest is spreading amongst the lawmakers, and that there really needs to be something done about this kind of activity. So I'm encouraged by that. The momentum is still there, I believe, but Congress is on a little bit of a recess right now. So when they kind of get back and get moving, it'll be interesting to see where they pick this back up. Also, I saw today, I think that it was either today or this week, that Senator Kirsten Gillibrand was in Nevada, having meetings with Lockheed and Northrop Grumman. So that's interesting. Not sure what's going on there. So we can certainly speculate a whole bunch about that. The point being that these senators who have had this direct knowledge of these allegations and a lot more substantive information, what is it that they're working on? What is it they're going to be doing in 2024 with this kind of information? Sheehan seems to paint a pretty strong picture that there's a lot of focused attention on that. There's a lot of coordinated effort between the White House and elements of Congress and moving this along and trying to achieve certain things. In the interview that you were talking about, he specifically mentions the Schumer Amendment and how just detailed that was, how much effort went into drafting that with the sole intent of trying to achieve this carefully coordinated disclosure plan. And so the question I have in my mind for this year is that going to get revived? Where are we going to see that movement go in 2024, particularly knowing that it's an election year and the partisan politics that are going on? How will that feature in the process in 2024? Will we see it in the debates? Will there even be debates? That's certainly an open question right now between these two candidates. So it's going to be very interesting in terms of U.S. and maybe perhaps global UFO official news. But I do think that there is clear evidence that the interest is still there, that maybe a lot of things are happening behind the scenes, not as vocally, but people are really still trying to move this ball forward from that legislative lawmaker perspective.
Right. And again, getting back to Steve Bassett, he has made the point that if we could have a few of these firsthand witness whistleblowers come forward in some sort of public hearing, then you would suddenly have bipartisan support for reintroducing something like the Schumer Amendment in its original form, and that it would be adopted very quickly in Bassett's perspective, who, again, we know is very optimistic about these things. But that might be what helps revive this and put us into overdrive. We shall see. The other thing I'll touch on briefly before we move on to our main course today is in terms of a couple things that are expected that will ultimately impact this conversation, I think. One is the David Grush op-ed that we are still expecting. I think we discussed that briefly last time. I remember there being conversation late last year that February might be the time frame that would happen. We were getting towards the end of the month, so perhaps that's not going to happen, but maybe in March. We also had a recent hoopla around the Elizondo book that's coming out. There was some false information published, I think just by accident, basically. It wasn't purposeful, suggesting a release date had been picked for November, and they already had the title. Elizondo has come out since then and said neither of those are the case, that the book is still being worked on and there is no finished title yet. But that we're also expecting sometime this year, although again, if he still has not even submitted it to the publisher, it makes you wonder how far away we are. And then there was also leaked information from a publisher website, I think, that Volume 6 of Jacques Vallée's Forbidden Science series is due to come out sometime this year, which makes more sense. Jacques is up there in years, and I think he wants to push out his final memoirs, and those are always very interesting because he so methodically records ufological history and what's been happening on the inside. And people really poured into Volume 5 and found some very interesting tidbits about history, and I'm sure that'll be the case with that book as well. So those are some of the things that are coming down the pipeline that will also impact this conversation.
Yeah, and let's not forget the James Fox documentary as well, the program. It sounded like he was pretty close to being able to release a trailer for that, so that'll certainly have an impact as well, particularly if he's able to present some firsthand testimony, which is what he's been hinting at, that he might have some of that in this particular production. So definitely some interesting things on the horizon that are going to keep this momentum moving forward. Okay, so we're in this intermediary period, and I think it's a good chance for us to do a little bit deeper of a dive into some of the leading hypotheses surrounding what this might be. And that's important too, because we're starting to see more and more individuals who are coming into this conversation, who are taking it seriously, not just lawmakers, but other academics. And when you see that influx of new interest, you also begin to see the common theories being put forth again and again. And, if you've been in this space for a long time, you're familiar with all of these, you understand, you may hold one in particular that you kind of value above all the others. You may hold all of them in some sort of suspension, but you're probably familiar with a lot of the leading hypotheses about what this all might be. And it's interesting, I've always found it fascinating to watch the new folks coming in, where they really start in terms of the conversation. And I think what's notable about this year, at the end of last year as well, is that a lot of the newcomers to this conversation aren't starting in the classical places that new people have typically started in the past. And here what I'm speaking to is they haven't started right off the bat with an extraterrestrial hypothesis as their leading hypothesis for what this might be. In fact, we're hearing a lot of folks talk about this interdimensional hypothesis. And so that is a signal from my perspective that the conversation in general is shifting in productive ways, because we have to get out of this very classical way of thinking about what this might be. It's not to say that there might not be extraterrestrial elements to this, but the reality of it all might be far more complex than just that classical notion of beings from another planet, another star system, whatever it may be. So if we're already talking about more complicated ideas, that's positive. That's really a good sign that this conversation is maturing, and maybe we're pushing it into new territory that I think we're going to have to move into as we really try to get our arms around what this might be in the 21st century.
For sure. And I think one of the interesting questions that arises, though, is to what extent are these lawmakers, these Congress people who are using the term interdimensional off the bat, like you say, as opposed to extraterrestrial? People like Luna have suggested they like that term because they heard David Grush using that term. But then, of course, that raises questions around how much is David Grush just waxing philosophic like everybody in UFO community does, and how much is actually based on intel, specific intel. I think, again, as I've been saying, interdimensional has become a placeholder for something that doesn't fit any of the usual categories, the usual players. So I think that's what's kind of emerged. And what's interesting is I've noticed some people having a conversation around the term interdimensional and meaning different things by it and not realizing they mean different things by it. Some people take it to mean something more spiritual, like an angelic kind of realm. Other people see it as like a parallel universe on the physical plane, but it's still based in physicalist assumptions. So that becomes interesting in itself. But yeah, when I first proposed that we do another deep dive into the hypotheses, I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One, as you just pointed to, it's relevant in the conversation right now. It's remarkable that we were having Congress people not only discuss this, but actually put forward one hypothesis over another. As you said, also, there's many, many, many people coming to this for the first time and having to grapple with this and not having decades of following the ET hypothesis and then only slowly over time migrating to something else. They are jumping in head first kind of thing, especially with the sense that things are happening and that something's coming. So I thought it'd be helpful for us to dive into each of these now that we've marinated on it for a few years, right? We've really been in the space, really feeling into these, seeing the evidence, being able to sit with, for a long period of time, the pros and cons for each of these. And to what extent are they also each dependent upon assumptions baked into physicalism, for instance, and Darwinianism and things like that. So we can get into that. And that's what I really wanted to do, was to do a deeper dive with nuance around each of these. But let's begin with the extraterrestrial hypothesis. I'll read the definition here. And then I also want to dive into Richard Dolan's book, UFOs and the National Security State. The second volume goes from 1973 to 1991, because he documents the shift that happened in the 1970s, where the assumption early in the decade was that this is extraterrestrials coming from Zeta Reticuli or whatever in spacecraft, to something much stranger. And people like Vallée, Hynek, and John Keel were kind of pioneers in taking us in a different direction. But before I read that, let's give a definition for the ETH, the extraterrestrial hypothesis. This hypothesis suggests that unidentified flying objects, UFOs, and encounters with beings or craft involve entities or technology from other planets or celestial bodies outside Earth. It proposes that these phenomena are manifestations of extraterrestrial intelligence. Unquote. So I'll let you riff on that for a second while I look up this quote in the book here.
Great. Well, okay. This is the one that's certainly the most prominent in our, I think, cultural lore about UFOs, that these are beings from some other, place than here. They have their own civilization. They have their own technology. They've just managed to travel these vast distances in space, and they've arrived. To me, there's like this strong vestige of contact with sort of other civilizations on Earth. Like there's this residue of, in a way, kind of like the colonial expansion that we have as a part of our history. And so it's familiar in that regard. It's let's travel across the ocean, and there are these strange people with these strange customs, and they live over here. We're just kind of, but we're all still human. We're all kind of connected in this similar way, and it kind of extrapolating that notion out further, we're replacing the ocean with space and other continents with other planets. So it's just really kind of leveling up of that concept, which makes sense. It's approachable in that regard. It's a way of thinking, expanding the scope of thought around that particular concept. But for me personally, I definitely don't feel like that's the whole story. I think that absolutely there's life out there in the universe other than here on Earth. It's just too big, and the probability is just too great that there are other, life forms out there, other advanced life forms, and far advanced from our own, all kinds of different things that have to exist. And, the puzzling question we're all familiar with, this Fermi paradox, why haven't we bumped into that before? And that's quite frustrating, I think, for many of us who've been studying this for some time. It's like, why haven't we found evidence of these other civilizations if it seems like they would be so prominent? So what's going on there? Is there some sort of, are we just not calibrating our instrumentation correctly, et cetera, et cetera? But even all of those questions that I just brought up there, they think about this issue from a very particular perspective and make some assumptions about what we think we'll be able to learn about life that exists elsewhere, and that it's, sort of similar to us. It's on a similar technological trajectory, that things just keep getting bigger and bigger, and therefore technosignatures are larger and larger. In fact, it could be completely the opposite. It could be that as technologies and civilizations advance, that things get smaller and smaller rather than larger and larger. There are a whole bunch of assumptions that are just baked into this search for extraterrestrial life. And I think it's a very approachable theory, but it's certainly not one that seems to, at least from my perspective, explain the scope of what we're seeing in all of these reported encounters.
Right. That's a good summary. And I think, yes, we should underline the fact that it's about defining the final frontier. So as you pointed to, oceans, new continents, or how we've thought about those things before. So it was logical and expected that we would then therefore assume that the next frontier, the only frontier really left, is outer space. One of the interesting, compelling, but troubling for some people notions is that actually there may be bases already here. There may be these notions of cryptoterrestrials, which we'll get to in a little bit here, suggesting that this frontier that we thought we had charted on planet Earth maybe not be so charted after all. And again, that raises questions around, is that just because they have technology that can hide them? Is it because they are existing on a different plane of existence than us, but on the planet? This is where these questions arise because of the data itself, which is so perplexing. Yes, absolutely. I agree with you that the sense is throughout science, basically, at this point, that with the size of the cosmos And even if Earth-like planets are the exception to the rule in that Goldilocks zone, there still would be so many billions of those that, again, we should see life everywhere. And to your point, the question then becomes, why don't we see it? Do these civilizations, like you say, go into a smaller scale? Do they move up into hyperspace? And again, even what that means differs depending on who you're listening to. So this really is, in an uncomfortable way, I think, shining a light on how little we know about reality itself, and that all of these are trying to come forward out of assumptions about the way that reality works. And part of what is, I think, making some people feel there's a certain unease to this is that some of the perplexing nature of the data suggests that perhaps those assumptions about reality are wrong to begin with. But let's return to the 1970s when this was really beginning to gain traction, and people like Stanton Friedman were really championing a scientific approach to this. And again, a scientific approach was really rallying around the extraterrestrial hypothesis. So I want to quote here from Richard Dolan's UFOs and the National Security State. This is the second volume of this. We'll jump in here. Quote, despite the personality clashes, all the groups promoted scientific ufology, quote unquote. Hynek made it the guiding principle of CUFOS, and MUFON stressed it just as much. Its proponents argued that in order for ufology to gain respectability, it needed to be conducted scientifically. MUFON was slowly developing an investigative methodology and a network of trained investigators. This was the ideal. Reality often lagged behind. But there were MUFON investigators who rigorously investigated baffling UFO cases, doing the legwork, interviewing witnesses, analyzing possible landing sites, preparing thorough reports. The goal of scientific ufology is surely laudable, and considering the state of affairs after the Cordon Committee report, understandable. It also served to depoliticize the issue to a large extent. Cover-ups and conspiracies were definitely out. So were such simplistic answers to the UFO mystery as the extraterrestrial hypothesis. Considering the Condon Committee's strong slap against the ETH, this too is understandable. More important, though, it was becoming obvious that there were simply too many bizarre reports which did not easily lead to a quote-unquote nuts and bolts explanation of alien creatures inside spaceships coming from another planet. Much of the influence behind this new perspective came from Jacques Vallée and John A. Keel. Both argued that UFOs could not possibly be extraterrestrial spacecraft. Vallée later postulated 5 arguments against the ETH. First, there were far too many UFO close encounters to explain them as a physical survey of the Earth. Second, the humanoid body structure of the alleged aliens, quote-unquote, was unlikely to have originated elsewhere and was not biologically adapted to space travel. Third, the behavior as described in so many abduction reports contradicted the idea that advanced aliens were conducting genetic or scientific experiments. Fourth, the phenomenon seemed to have been recorded throughout human history. Fifth, the apparent ability of UFOs to manipulate space and time suggested different and richer alternatives to mere extraterrestrials. Thus, not aliens and flying saucers, but intelligences from other dimensions were interacting with humanity according to this hypothesis. By the early 1970s, the idea was widespread among researchers and has continued as a significant school of thought to the present day. Even the astronomer Hynek, who worked closely with Vallée during the 1970s, accepted a good portion of it. Unquote. So what's your take on all of that?
Well, that's good. That's good stuff. It's meaty. I like it. Okay. Well, I don't think that, I don't think that it holds water anymore in terms of the comprehensive way to explain what's going on. So I think that it's pointing out the flaws in the hypothesis, and rightly so, because it, to me, if you look at the accounts of what's happening, abduction experiences, et cetera, it just doesn't make sense. It doesn't. I thought about it this way too. So look at it from the standpoint of where we are as a civilization. If we just take our growth as a starting point here, there's really no point if we're continuing in the trajectory that we're on. There's not. I know someone's going to flame me in the comments on this, but there's not much of a point for us to do deep space exploration ourselves, because we would basically send, sort of probes, etc., out there and kind of be our virtual presence to those places. One, but two, our imaginal spaces, our creative spaces that are coming online even right now are so expansive and amazing that it's easy to conceive of a civilization that would essentially kind of do ultimate navel gazing, as it continues to mature, because it has the technologies to just immerse itself in all kinds of imaginal scenarios that are maybe more interesting than any sort of exploration of the solar system. And I know there are individuals in this society that would still hop on a spaceship today and go wherever they might want to go. But it strikes me as odd that an advanced extraterrestrial civilization would even have a need to do these kinds of experiments on humans and gather samples and all the things that have been reported that they're doing. Like, it just doesn't seem like there would be any need for them to do that, particularly at that level of technological advancement that we kind of assume that they might have. So I don't think that it's a very compelling hypothesis just on those grounds. But in addition to that, I think it seems to me very obvious that we are overlaying so many of our own ways of looking at reality, of studying reality, of interacting with it, of technology, even technology, right? We're overlaying all these very familiar things to us onto these experiences, and then just saying, well, they're like us, but they're on another planet. It's a huge assumptive leap in my mind that isn't necessarily warranted, although I understand that it's familiar. So I just think that if you think a little harder about it, it kind of starts shaking quite a bit as to, why it would be a leading hypothesis.
Right, and I would like to dive into each of Vallée's arguments against the ETH, because maybe some of the evidence has changed over time that those might be questionable now. But one of the things I would introduce here, first of all, is that even amongst our UFO community, there's still some people who argue that the most parsimonious answer is still the ETH. It requires the least additional leaps in terms of postulating aspects of reality we don't have evidence for yet. So in those people's minds, it's still the most likely. I would also argue that some of these will combine, right? Some of these will be transcended into a model that includes different aspects of them. So if it's true that space-time is one part of reality, but perhaps only a certain lens of seeing reality a certain way, then it still might play in. So for instance, I think about podcast episodes I've done where I discuss what are known as the blue men or the blue humans. These are very tall, blue-hued humanoid beings that basically look human, but that also sometimes can appear in light form. And that actually they will say that for the sake of humans, they sometimes take on humanoid form, but they don't have to do that. Now, what's interesting there, of course, when you hear about light beings, there's this notion of that sounds celestial, that sounds kind of angelic. And even there's cases I've described in my podcast episodes on POC where these Vietnam vets, while they're in Vietnam, would have these near-death experiences, would be rescued and taken up. And it was right when they were praying to Jesus or something for some sort of salvation, some sort of rescue. And so they were assuming in the midst of this experience that they had been rescued by Jesus. When they saw these light beings, they assumed they were angels. And then they found out in conversation with these beings that, no, actually, we are a biological species that has now developed the capacity to exist in light form. But we can go back and forth. But we began as biological beings just like you. That's really fascinating because it, again, collapses some of these categories. That light being doesn't necessarily mean celestial or interdimensional. It can begin as something biological that develops an understanding of reality where this becomes possible. Furthermore, they argued that it was actually because of ecological collapse on their planet that they developed a need to actually transmute into light beings. So this is really fascinating to me because they say that they did come from a different planet. They were originally biological, but they've now transcended that need. Furthermore, they also have transcended the need to travel across the vast expanse of the cosmos. That this also is mirrored in ancient Vedantic thinking and different Eastern cosmologies, the notion that space and time is largely illusory and that everything is now and everything is here. And if that's true, then suddenly these complaints that people raise about the distances are just too vast for spacecraft to get here, even if they were traveling close to the speed of light, not only, first of all, might we very well have craft that can travel at superliminal speeds, that is faster than the speed of light, but it might be the case that a certain frame of reality, once we achieve that, we realize that space and time are illusory, and there's ways that we can supersede that altogether. So this is interesting because what it does is it still brings the ETH into the picture, but in the midst of transcending a much too truncated model of reality altogether.
Yeah, well, I see very much your integral view coming into play there, and I think that that's a valid way to look at this, that these, and here what I'm talking about, for those that may not know what I'm talking about, is that, Darren has a great capacity to look at, a certain theory and understand how that becomes nested into something that supersedes it, transcends and includes it. And that's a really great way to look at this generally, because that's really kind of how our knowledge is, I would argue that's how our knowledge grows. There's a connecting point from idea to idea, and therefore you're not like kind of making a leap that is completely untethered from where you jumped from. There is a connection there, and that connection will always be part of what comes behind it, and it has to include and very much includes it, but also transforms it into something new. And that's, I guess, what we're seeing there in the evolution of the thinking in the 1970s, as the world began to mature, as our scientific knowledge began to expand. We got away from some of the maybe kind of Buck Rogers way of looking at the universe and started to think a little bit more esoterically about what might be going on there. And interestingly enough about that too, though, is we're also dipping into some of our ancient perspectives. So there's very much this kind of, as I mentioned before, this kind of colonial or sort of modern era way of looking at this as an extraterrestrial entity from some other planet. But as you point out, there are elements in our ancient past that are kind of woven into this concept now as well. Our ancient mythologies and this celestial concept, the spiritual realm. So a blending in a way of these two ideas begins to take shape. And I think that's something that we're going to continue to see as this moves forward, is we're going to kind of dip back into things that maybe we discarded at one point, but are going to put those things back on the drawing table, but transform them in our new analysis of it.
Right, and Bernardo Castro would say actually this brief excursion into physicalism is incredibly brief, that it has not been long-lasting at all, that for the vast majority of history around the world, as well as Western history, something like idealism actually took the fore in terms of our way of understanding reality. So we assume, again, kind of arrogantly, that we have, through logic and reason, achieved this greater understanding that has very squarely made the case that idealism was wrong and that physicalism is correct. But actually, that's not what the evidence suggests at all. And that Bernardo furthermore believes that we are definitely headed back towards idealism, that revolution is already well underway, which brings to mind and also relates to what you were just talking about in terms of these transcensions into new ways of saying things, what I discussed in terms of Thomas Kuhn's work around the structure of scientific revolutions, that counter to conventional thinking, science doesn't always progress in a linear fashion, and it's not always incremental and additive. We actually have these points in time where you have disruption, where the new anomalous data is so extensive that it causes a complete revolution, a rewriting of things. I point here to the quantum revolution, for instance. Prior to that, most scientists thought we had this pretty much figured out. It was just, dotting I's and crossing T's at that point, sort of just narrowing down the fine details. And then we actually, in trying to finally get to the smallest particles of reality and have some sort of complete perspective on reality, we realize actually these really small aspects of reality behave in ways that don't at all adhere to relative kind of physics. And so that created a whole revolution that we're still grappling with. And many scientists still think something must be wrong about the data because it's so perplexing. And that's 100 years after the initial quantum experiments. I think the key is that along Kuhn's thinking is that we get to points where you'll even have two groups of scientists, one that's still holding to the old view and a group of people holding to the new view, and that these two are incommensurable, that they can't even talk to each other because their assumptions about reality are so different, which is fascinating. And this has happened historically. and many would argue we're in the midst of it now. Again, Bernardo would suggest we're in the midst of that. He says that when he debates with different people 20, 30 years ago, he would be laughed out of the room coming forward with something like idealism. Now that's not the case at all. And again, what's interesting is John Mack in the 90s sought out Thomas Kuhn, was actually childhood friends with Thomas Kuhn. But he sought him out because he knew that what he was encountering with this data didn't land squarely, comfortably in any perspective we currently had, that it was going to have to be transcended. But he wanted to know how he could talk about it, almost again, using placeholder terms until we land at something that feels more substantial. And that was, of course, where we were in the 90s, and it's still where we are today. But before we jump into the interdimensional, I just want to quickly touch on these 5 points, these 5 arguments Vallée made, and we'll see if they still sort of hold water. The first one is interesting. He talks about there being far too many close encounters to explain them as a physical survey. So what he did basically here is he extrapolated the math and said, if you take all of the cases around the world every year that involve people seeing or interacting with these beings, then we're in the millions. And he's like, what kind of scientific expedition has to repeat an experiment millions of times? He just didn't square with the notion of how we would conduct science. Again, we have to be careful of anthropocentric kind of perspectives here. So that was his first point. The second of one is well taken, the humanoid body shape. And this is exactly why our friend Mike Masters has postulated the extratempestrial hypothesis, that these beings are us from the future. While that hypothesis did exist at the time that Vallée and Hynek and Keel were talking about these things in the 70s, it was less prominent than it is now. We had less evidence then pointing in this direction. But as you and I have talked about, there's a couple ways you can look at that. On the one, it could be that they are descended from us, and that's why they have that common humanoid shape. Or, as we've discussed, it could be that there was some sort of templating that happened from some ancient cosmic seeding program, and that explains why we see this common humanoid shape. So, in that sense, we sort of agree with Vallée, but we have some extra wrinkles we can add to it. The third is that the behavior described in so many abduction reports contradicted the idea that advanced aliens were conducting genetic or scientific experiments. And this speaks to Vallée's sense that some of these looked more like shamanic initiation rituals and those kinds of things, like magic rituals. It didn't seem like a purely clinical, scientific kind of experiment. And as we pointed out before, and many people have noticed, for instance, even with the hybridization campaign, it's perplexing why they couldn't just take a strand of hair, why they couldn't raid a sperm bank. Why do they need to take people up into spaceships? I mean, that's still an ongoing question. As much as I'm very familiar with this particular data because of my work with the John Mack Institute, it's still perplexing why it had to happen that way. Fourth, the phenomenon seemed to have been recorded throughout human history. In other words, this didn't fit with the notion that these were recent travelers from a distant galaxy that were here to conduct this experiment, that perhaps we had had these encounters all through history, and that also perhaps just our cultural framing described them differently, but that might have been the same phenomenon throughout history. And then finally, the apparent ability of UFOs to manipulate space and time suggested different and richer alternatives to mere extraterrestrials. I think the term that Vallée actually used was interesting ideas, more interesting ideas than the ETH. And that's well taken, which speaks to what we talked about a few minutes ago, that space and time itself seem to be in question here. And if that's the case, then something that relies on our notion, our contemporary notion of space-time being accurate might be off kilter. So that gives us some idea of what Vallée was thinking back then and what still holds water and what doesn't. Any final thoughts on the ETH before we go on to the interdimensional?
Well, the last thought I would say is I totally understand the line of reasoning that he's going with there, but we also have no idea what an extraterrestrial civilization would look like, how it would behave, what it would deem to be normal or not normal. And so all of his critiques, which I think are valid and completely logical, you could certainly combat each one and say, well, I mean, this is just how this particular extraterrestrial civilization behaves. Like, this is just what they do. And I agree that it doesn't make sense from a human anthropocentric standpoint, but from the way that they interact with, things in their exploratory, kind of framework, this is just who they are. And, perhaps, all these different instances of them abducting people and the different appearances over time and ancient history, et cetera. I mean, we don't have any idea in terms of what their sense of time is, for example. How old are they? So there are lots of, to me, there are lots of critiques you could make of his critique of the hypothesis, and you could still end up landing firmly with extraterrestrial. So I'm leaving room for that as a possibility. I know there are some big fans of that hypothesis, so it's okay if you want to still be there. I think that is certainly plausible as a hypothesis, and as we've talked about many times, it, I think, is very much a part of the overall mix. It just may not be the all-encompassing answer to what this might be.
Right, we are agreed on that point. All right, so then we're moving into the interdimensional hypothesis, which emerged in the 1970s, as we just read about. And this was because of the nature of the data itself, was suggesting a more unique kind of origin for these beings. The definition for the interdimensional hypothesis is as follows. The interdimensional hypothesis proposes that UFOs and related phenomena originate from dimensions or realities beyond the conventional three-dimensional space we perceive. It suggests that these entities or crafts may slip into or out of our dimension, explaining their elusive and often inexplicable behavior, unquote. So give me your initial take on the interdimensional hypothesis.
Yeah, well, sure. I mean, I think it's, as we've talked about, and this is my feeling about interdimensional generally, is it is kind of a catch-all sort of, it could mean almost anything. It's just that it means that it's not here and it's somewhere else. And so in this somewhere else place, this is where the phenomena resides, and it just kind of pops into our reality whenever it decides to do so. Okay, and that's very interesting and certainly plausible. And I think the easiest sort of corollary to that way of thinking is thinking about flat land in 3 dimensions and hyperdimensions above 3-4 dimensions, and how that might work. And we certainly can extrapolate down from 3 that we're all used to and go, oh yeah, there could be a kind of corollary up experience, and therefore that's where these kinds of beings might be. So I think it's understandable and approachable from that regard, but I don't know. It's it doesn't feel to me to be like as deeply explanatory, like because I think in part because it is so nebulous in a way. Like it's just kind of, there's not really a whole lot to it. It's just like, well, they're out there in this other parallel reality somehow, and we just can't perceive them. And whenever they decide to show up is when they show up. But there's like a whole other. I'm living in their living room right now. I just don't even know it. It's certainly possible, but I just don't know that it, for me at least, is explains the depth and breadth of what we are hearing about in the literature of experience.
Right, and you make a good point in the sense that just because we can apply a term doesn't mean that we're really mapping that to our precise understanding of reality. And we can sometimes confuse the two. We can feel comfortable that it's not the ETH, at least that's not a sufficient answer. So we add this additional aspect, but that doesn't mean we really understand how it works. Again, many people would make the point that we have zero empirical evidence, really, that parallel universes exist. Bernardo would be very pointed about that. So again, partly this was arising in the 1970s because of these notions within science that there were these parallel universes, which of course arose as a hypothesis to explain why our universe seems so well tuned to life. And so that suggested perhaps a creator or a design. And of course, many scientists at the time did not like that notion. And so they postulated that perhaps there are innumerable universes, and we just happen, of course, to be in the one that we would arise in. But there are many others that would not be conducive to life as we understand it. So people like Vallée said that could possibly explain, for instance, why they're popping in and popping out. Maybe they're going into one of these other parallel universes, which again, Bernardo would point out we have zero empirical evidence for. What's interesting, too, is that people like Mike Masters would also say when they blip in and blip out, they might be moving through time, not through space. And when you think about the DeLorean suddenly disappearing in Back to the Future, it's something like that could happen too. And people would argue, again, this is a pretty, like you say, catch-all kind of hypothesis because people throw the time travel aspect into the interdimensional. They would say that moving across time is a kind of interdimensional travel. So yes, it's, as we are saying here, it's kind of a catch-all. It probably is pointing to something that we will eventually be able to more robustly understand and describe. It's for now a happy placeholder that gets us there when we don't really quite understand how to do so. Now, that still lands squarely within at least theoretical science, right? The next one we're going to discuss sort of takes this beyond that, and that's the ultra-terrestrial hypothesis, which is defined as follows. The ultra-terrestrial hypothesis extends the interdimensional idea further, proposing that entities or phenomena are not just from different dimensions, but are part of an existence beyond our understanding of the natural universe. This hypothesis may encompass beings or forces that exist on a higher plane of reality or consciousness, unquote.
Okay. So it's like interdimensional, but new Coke, it's like the same, but a little bit different. Yeah. I mean, it's, to me, these are like really creative, almost science fiction-y kind of hypotheses that just extend out into more and more speculative territory. And I think that's great in the sense that we need more speculation as to where this phenomena resides or how it functions, because clearly our initial models of whatever it is, like, they're not adequate enough. So we need to encourage some really interesting speculative thinking about what this might be. And so I view ultra-terrestrial as, sort of a further spin out from interdimensional, as just like, well, let's speculate further on that, where it could also be this. It could be this, kind of other way of looking at it, that's outside, even beyond the interdimensional space. So, certainly possible, but I don't know that we have great empirical evidence for that either. And so it becomes, in some ways, these theories become a kind of God of the gaps explanation for trying to make a cohesive explanation for the disparate phenomena that is witnessed.
Right. And what's interesting here is that this particular definition is a bit different than some of the other definitions I've come across. So I think Hal Puthoff, who described a definition of ultra-terrestrials, might be a little bit different than this. There are some times where there's kind of a cross between crypto-terrestrial and interdimensional when people think about the ultra-terrestrials.
Right.
But what is interesting here, and this also, like you say, speaks to the speculative nature of this also verges on extra-dimensional, right? So we also have that described sometimes, that these beings might be extra-dimensional, meaning that they're outside of space-time altogether, that perhaps can come into space-time. But of course, that assumes that space-time is a real thing and not an illusion, or not a derivative aspect of some deeper process, which are most cutting-edge physics put forward by people like Nima Arkani-Hamed, that I talked a lot about last year, are suggesting. So again, this really makes us feel a bit inadequate in some ways, that the things we have long assumed are solid aspects of the universe, constants we can rely upon, that we can build greater and greater structures around, suddenly get called into question because of the nature of data itself.
Yeah, and
so yes, I generally agree with you that the ultra-terrestrial is interesting, it's speculative, it perhaps even opens up the possibility of, again, celestial or spiritual or angelic realms coming in here as well. That's possible. There are some people who have kind of like a dualistic understanding still, where beings that are in a celestial realm or spiritual realm are distinct from everyone that's living in the physical realm, right? So in that sense, that kind of bleeds in as well. So yes, it's worth thinking about, but it's interesting.
Yeah, I just want to quickly kind of add to that, because if you look at these hypotheses, how they're structured, one of the core assumptions is that we have a corner on what base reality or the originating dimension happens to be. That's where we reside, right? So to some degree, these are almost kind of classically, like, I don't know, Gnostic principles or whatnot, these different realms of reality that are sort of like a Russian nesting doll. We're within kind of a base layer, and then these other layers just sort of lay on top of it. I mean, that's a huge assumption to make, that there is even this distinction worth making. Like there are these distinct dimensional realms that exist apart from one another, and this whole even concept of blipping in and blipping out, right, is implying that they're kind of piercing that veil into our reality. And I think that's not really necessarily a valid assumption to make at all. Like we may not even need this kind of demarcation, in other words.
Absolutely. And to take that a step further, according to the work of someone like Donald Hoffman, he would say we're mistaking base reality for our perception of what's around us. And those are not the same thing. He would argue that we have a interface we rely upon to make it through the world, because what's actually out there in ultimate reality is such a complex barrage of data that we couldn't possibly know how to navigate it. We would be completely overcome by a sheer assault of data. And so we have learned over time through the evolutionary process to not only perceive a subset of that barrage of data, but actually to translate it into a kind of an interface with icons that don't at all in a one-to-one way describe what actual reality, base reality, looks like. And so to your point, yes, we are mistaking our lack of perception for the existence of multiple realms or multiple dimensions, when actually that might be all around interpenetrating happening right now. And again, getting back to ancient Vedantic and Eastern cosmologies, this notion that space and time are ultimately illusory, that everything happens now and here. There's nothing but that. And in that sense, you would have all of this happening in, quote unquote, the same space. So that's absolutely something we should consider. And I think people like Bernardo and Don Hoffman have really helped us to understand that at the very least, we need to acknowledge the distinction between what we perceive versus what is real. And again, Don Hoffman makes the point that according to mathematical theorems that he's developed along with his colleagues, the chances that we are perceiving base reality as it is are precisely zero. So this really introduces a major X factor into this conversation, because now we need to not only consider what is the nature of reality, but how much is our perceptual set even able to take that in? And Don Hoffman has made the point that the reason why the Fermi paradox exists, which speaks to what you mentioned in the beginning, where in this vast expanse of the cosmos, why aren't we seeing the existence of life, the traces of life? Don Hoffman would say it's because space-time is our unique evolutionarily derived headset. It's the interface we use to make it through the world. It's not depicting base reality. And that he actually furthermore believes that likely that base reality is probably teeming with life. We just don't have the usual capacity to perceive it because it wasn't necessary for the propagation of the species. Full stop. And I think it's a very compelling argument. And furthermore, when you think about experiences in non-ordinary states and how these beings seem to take people into what they perceive as an alternate reality, sometimes a reality that seems much more real than this one. And when you think about evidence into psychedelics and how that also feels more real, then people can interact with beings that seem to have ontological status that's distinct from us and is ongoing, right? That different people can encounter the same beings, or sometimes 5 years apart in these psychedelic journeys can encounter the same beings who remember them and pick up the conversation like it was yesterday. So this is absolutely something that has been introduced to our understanding and introduced into the mix since the time of the 70s when Vallée and Keel and Hynek were trying to make sense of this. So I think this really does call into question, as someone like Don Hoffman would say, that each of these hypotheses so far assume that reality is equivalent to what we perceive, at least to a subset. And that really is questionable in light of the research that Don Hoffman's done. All right, now we're going to wrap these up with a couple more, and then we want to jump into this paper that Vallée and Davis put forward that's really interesting in terms of grappling with this. And they were equally critical of both ufologists and the scientific community in this paper. But the next one I want to discuss briefly here is the crypto-terrestrial hypothesis, which posits that this is a more Earth-based speculation. It suggests that some UFOs are mysterious entities that are not extraterrestrial, but rather hidden or cryptic terrestrial beings or civilizations that coexist with humanity but remain largely undetected. Proponents of this hypothesis propose that these entities may inhabit unexplored or inaccessible regions on Earth, unquote. Your initial thoughts?
Well, this one to me is a little bit better because I think it's a little bit more unitive in looking at what this may be, because instead of postulating that it's coming from far away or it's coming from some sort of parallel experience that we're not sort of confined within or in the bounds of our experience, that it's been here all along. It's just that we have amnesia in terms of our deep history on this earth and all the things that may have taken place before we came on the scene and started actually writing things down. We just assume that we're the pinnacle of evolution and nothing smart ever came before us. So I think it challenges that assumption, and it fits together with what Bernardo Kastrup talked about in his recent paper, the Silurian hypothesis. So these two ideas are very much on the same page, that there were ancient civilizations, that at least one that may have been advanced, and they perhaps developed enough technology to continue to survive, even though life on the surface of the planet may have changed dramatically over the vast expanse of geologic time, and they now live in parts of the earth that just we're not habitating in. I think that that's very plausible. I mean, the earth is huge. We really haven't pierced even a great depth of the crust of the planet. The ocean is extremely vast, and it's just taking this assumption that, well, I mean, because we cover most of the surface, like we're the top dog in the scenario here, I think is a pretty big assumption to make. So I find this hypothesis to be more compelling, to be honest, and I guess I would say moving in more of the correct direction in terms of trying to explain this from a holistic perspective.
I would point out, as I know we would both agree, these are not mutually exclusive, these different hypotheses, that this might be one element in play. And speaking of evidence that might support this, one of the interesting things I've seen in terms of an overlay is areas of the world, and even of like North America, where abductions have taken place and where mountains and caves kind of exist. Mm-hmm. And there's an interesting overlap there, where there seems to be a preponderance of abductions that happen in places where there is mountain structures and cave dwellings and those kinds of things, basically where there's these openings that descend into the cavities of the earth, basically, including the Blue Ridge Mountains where you and I live, by the way. And so be careful when you go hiking, Nathan.
That's right.
Now, yes, you pointed out that Bernardo Kastrup recently relied on this, although he didn't mention this by name, but he's definitely speaking to this kind of notion. And you mentioned the Silurian hypothesis. So just quickly, let me describe what that is. The Silurian hypothesis refers to a speculative idea proposed by scientist and science fiction author Adam Frank, along with co-author Gavin Schmidt, in a 2018 study published in the International Journal of Astrobiology. The hypothesis explores the possibility that advanced civilizations may have arisen on Earth in the distant past, potentially during the Silurian period, which occurred around 443 to 419 million years ago. The Silurian hypothesis draws inspiration from the concept of deep time and the idea that complex life forms could have evolved on Earth multiple times over its vast history. The authors suggest that if an ancient technological civilization did exist during the Silurian period, evidence of its existence might be difficult to detect due to geological processes erasing most traces over millions of years. Unquote. Now, of course, they're proposing the notion that these beings might have existed in the distant past and then no longer do, and we don't have any capacity to see their structures and whatnot because plate tectonics would have erased them multiple times over by now. But of course, what Bernardo is saying is that, wait a second, if we have craft and hangars that have been recovered, and if we have bodies that are in gurneys somewhere, then perhaps the most reasonable explanation, that's what he basically argued in that essay, is that this fits with the Silurian hypothesis, that these are ancient humanoid-type beings, right, would also fit, according to his perspective. The reason why they look humanoid is because they did indeed arise and evolve on the same basic environmental situation as we have, and that would explain why we have a kind of common form. So again, yes, that's what he proposed, and as you and I both pointed out, it's interesting in light of him being an idealist that he landed on such a physicalist kind of perspective to make sense of this. I think this speaks to the notion that some people like to divide the notion of things to happen kind of in a third realm, an alternate state of consciousness, versus something like craft sitting in hangars that have been recovered and bodies. That, I think, made him lean towards this. Mm-hmm. He thinks that the high strangeness thing, actually points this out in the paper, is something else entirely. So he's sort of bifurcating there and saying we may have two different kinds of entities and interactions all together. And this just speaks to the one that maps to physical craft and carbon-based bodies, basically.
Right.
All right. The extratempestrial, of course, was proposed most recently by our friend Mike Masters. He is an evolutionary biologist. Again, what he tells the story of is when he saw the front cover of Communion when he was a kid, I think as a 10-year-old or something, he immediately thought, that being's got to be related to us, which is interesting because most people look at that and go, that dude's an alien. But what he thought was, that is clearly humanoid. The chances are it's going to be related to us in some way. And then he went on, of course, to do his PhD in this work and has since then drawn a lot of really clear evidence around the notion that this is a parsimonious kind of way of looking at this, that there's just too much we have in common with them for them not to be related to us. He's pretty convinced of it. And of course, then we bring in the notion of time travel. And this is compelling in a sense that not only could they travel from the future to our present, and of course the argument is that they may be abducting us and taking DNA because they have experienced some sort of malady in their time. They've run into some sort of evolutionary dead end and they need to come back and get fresh material to be able to get out of that situation. And of course, what's interesting is even in the John Mack material, the abduction data that I've looked at, there are definitely times where they tell people that they are from our future. There was someone on social media recently who posted about an experience he had where he was able to sit down in gray and ask them questions. And what was interesting there, which speaks to what I said earlier about this, these are not mutually exclusive hypotheses. This being said, when he was asked, are you guys aliens? He answered after a brief pause, I can understand why you would think that, but no, we're actually you from the future. But then when the second question that was asked was, are therefore all aliens actually just future humans? He said no. He said that there are multiple kinds of beings interacting with human beings, and they have different origin sources from different parts of the cosmos, again, pointing more to the extraterrestrial hypothesis again. So this is more in line with my perspective, that actually we have different groups with different origin sources altogether interacting with us. And I think part of the way we do a disservice to the data is we try to collapse it into one thing, and that's why it looks so confusing. But what are your thoughts on the extratempestrial model, which again, of course, speaks to the extra is referring to time, tempestrial, this notion that these beings are somehow us from the future?
Yeah, well, I find it very compelling. And for the reasons that you mentioned, certainly the physiological similarities, as well as that's just found in the accounts from many individuals where they've had experiences with these beings, and this is really what they have been communicated to. So I find it, highly plausible in that regard. Space-time very much is malleable, it doesn't exist in the sense that we think that it does, and it would make sense that if at some point we're able to kind of hit the ejection button from the space-time trap that we're in, it's going to introduce all kinds of strange sort of possibilities that we would have in front of us, in front of our species. Not only like traveling these vast distances that we can't seem to cover now with ease, but encountering other beings, other entities who then might realize that we're where we are, right? So just by virtue of us being able to traverse those spaces and come into contact with those other beings, a whole host of possibilities open up. What kind of technological exchange is happening there? What kind of biological enhancement perhaps might be underway just by, again, through the technological exchange that might be taking place. And then because we interact with these other extraterrestrial species, maybe they then want to come back and study, what we were like in our ancient past as well. So it has these elements, like you said, it has these compelling elements of the extraterrestrial hypothesis, but also, I think, hints at the direction of where we're kind of going with our own technology. So I find it a very compelling and interesting hypothesis. I certainly don't think it explains everything that there is to it. And I also kind of want to echo what you said earlier about this sort of template that may be in place within sort of the cosmos itself. We have this assumption that, we just sort of arose out of the earth like we are, and no other life arises in this way. and that nothing basically seeded us from the very beginning. And if we challenge that assumption, if we challenge that premise, then everything is on the table. I mean, for all we know, all life in the universe could have a very common hominid sort of template, all evolved life. And so if that's the case, there could be, and this is also in the literature, as you well know, there could be humans on other planets that look just like us and just are much, much older than we are. So I find that to be certainly compelling and interesting. I think we need more empirical evidence for that, but there is good evidence for that in the encounter literature.
Right. And one other point to make is that if time travel now exists, that's a funny way of putting it, then the implication is that not only could they come to our present, but they could also go into our past as well. So in that sense, Mike would argue that some of the cave paintings we find in ancient human history might actually be depictions of future humans going back into a time prior to our time. Of course, as you and I pointed out, that is a bit of a God of the Gaps argument in a sense. Like, it's logical, it's rational, it's reasonable, but it also is something that as of right now, we have no way of empirically proving one way or the other. But it's certainly interesting. And what's particularly interesting about that account that I referred to that someone shared on social media, where they, as a 10-year-old, had this conversation with this gray, is that, just to be clear, this gray also said that they now exist on a different planet, far, far from the Earth. So in that sense, they are both extraterrestrials and extratempestrials. And again, because they've been able to move through time, you could also argue that they're interdimensionals. So this all speaks to the fact that these kind of blend together at some point and speak to actually the insufficiency of some of our founding assumptions when we tried to postulate about any of this. Mm-hmm. But that said, speaking of postulating about these things, let's jump into this paper that was penned by Jacques Vallée and Eric Davis, two people that have been in this for decades, some of the most well-known people that have seen some of the top secret material as well, the classified information. I'm thinking here specifically of Davis, although Vallée has also held security clearances at points in his lifetime. Let's jump into this paper, which is titled Incommensurability, Orthodoxy, and the Physics of High Strangeness, a 6-layer model for anomalous phenomena. That is quite tongue twister, isn't it? Yeah. Okay, let's jump into the abstract, which gives us a quick sort of survey of what they're going to be discussing. Quote, the main argument presented in this paper is that the continuing study of unidentified aerial phenomena, UAP, may offer an existence theorem for new models of physical reality. The current SETI paradigm and its assumption of mediocrity place restrictions on forms of non-human intelligence that may be researched. A similar bias exists in the ufologist often stated hypothesis that UAP, if real, must represent space visitors. Observing that both models are biased by anthropomorphism, the authors attempt to clarify the issues surrounding quote-unquote high strangeness observations by distinguishing 6 layers of information that can be derived from UAP events, namely 1, physical manifestations, 2, anti-physical effects, 3, psychological factors, 4, physiological factors, 5, psychic effects, and 6, cultural effects. In a further step, they propose a framework for scientific analysis of unidentified aerial phenomena that takes into account the incommensurability problem. Unquote. Initial thoughts on that abstract?
Well, what jumps out at me right away is the first sentence, the phrase, existence theorem for new models of physical reality. So right there, I sort of know a little bit about where they want to go, and that's still an explanatory framework that falls within a physicalist kind of assumption. And I think that these different layers, the way that they've articulated the layers, that to me also speaks to the orientation that they have toward this problem, that it is a physical problem to crack. And once we figure it out, then we've just added to our existing physical model of reality. That there's a thread we just can't quite see right now that will connect these things together and then fit within our physicalist paradigm. So that jumps out at me. I could be wrong in that take. But I applaud the fact that what they're trying to do here is argue that the traditional sort of orthodox approaches from the scientific community about assumptions about what non-human intelligent life might look like, as well as orthodox positions within the ufological community, that those kind of sort of base positions of assumption are each inadequate in their own right to really fully, properly explain these strange things that happen collectively in UFO experiences.
Right. And what jumps out to me is this, quote, assumption of mediocrity. Right. So they are calling out SETI there and saying that, and I think we discussed this on a podcast episode perhaps a year and a half ago or so, that SETI set out to try to discover radio signals in terms of technosignatures from these civilizations. And what's ironic about that is that, number one, we don't know that another species would necessarily even go through that particular point in their history. And even when you look at our history, it was basically a decade or so that we really were set on radio signals, and then we were moving on to something else entirely. So you're not only making assumptions about that are, again, anthropological in the sense that we assumed they would go through a similar trajectory as we would, but even in our trajectory, that was such a small window in our history that it seems like a strange thing to focus on. And the reason why they use this expression, assumption of mediocrity, is because, again, it's based on these assumptions. And it's strange to spend millions and millions of dollars and put all your eggs in that one basket. And perhaps the reason why the Fermi paradox exists, again, is not because there aren't technosignatures, but we're looking for the wrong ones. That's what I take from that.
Yeah.
And yes, one thing I've always appreciated about Vallée is he even recently will say that he's the one ufologist who still claims he doesn't know what's going on, whereas everybody else has these clear theories. So he's always been a little bit outside of the box, critiquing the tribe that he's a part of in some ways. And as you say, he sort of equally critiqued the scientific community and their weak attempt to try to think through how you would detect these kind of technosignatures, but also the fact that ufologists wanting to be accepted by that scientific mainstream are fully baked in on this notion that they're space visitors. All right, let me jump into a next quote here, and then we will riff on that. Quote, "The rational study of reported cases of unidentified aerospace phenomena, UAP, is currently at an impasse. The situation has as much to do with the incomplete state of our models of physical reality as it does with the complexity of the data. A primary objection to the reality of UAP events among scientists is that witnesses consistently report objects whose seemingly absurd behavior cannot possibly be related to actual phenomena, even under extreme conditions. Skeptics insist that intelligent extraterrestrial visitors simply would not perpetrate such antics as are reported in the literature. This argument can be criticized as an anthropocentric, self-selected observation resulting from our own limited viewpoint as 21st century Homo sapiens trying to draw conclusions about the nature of the universe. Nonetheless, the high strangeness of many reports must be acknowledged," unquote.
Yeah, I mean, I think Vallée, in many ways, was the pioneer willing to acknowledge that all these weird things are happening in association with the sighting of a craft, and to take those things seriously, and not just take them seriously, but take a broader lens to this, and say, well, this isn't a modern thing that we're seeing, just because now we're flying planes in the atmosphere, or maybe we're sending spacecraft out into orbit, but it's something that seems to be appearing in our written history as well. So, I applaud him for kind of championing that aspect of this, because before he did so, I think we really were kind of locked into these narrow bands of thinking about the entire problem. So, I mean, that what you read there, again, just for me, reiterates my appreciation for Vallée and what he's trying to do here. I get frustrated sometimes with his failure to land, but I think it's a reasonable position to have, because these things are quite strange, and how do you harmonize them within a working theory? As you and I have talked about, it's very difficult to do with the current toolkit that we happen to have.
Right, and so I would bring to mind here the fact that what Vallée noticed was that because of this bias that existed amongst the ufological community, the high strangeness was vastly unreported and underreported, right? So there are many ufologists that literally would do an initial inquiry to an abductee or person who had a strange encounter, and if it was too strange, they would either edit out those aspects or they would just choose not to visit them and take that report at all. Mm. And there was a long time where MUFON was kind of accused of that as well, that they really underrepresented and underreported that data, and only more recently have really begun to consider experiencer literature as something key to understand what's going on. So that's something to be considered here, that it's bizarre bias on our part to assume what these things should look like, and if they don't look like that, we just exclude it, which again is human folly. All right, let's move on to the next quote, but I just want to say one more point before that. This speaks to the high strangeness. This speaks to a couple examples where this is really perplexing to us. It seems to confound the way we think about things altogether, where we see this blending of categories that we think of as completely distinct. So one example would be, for instance, in the Whitley Strieber archives, from the letters that he and his late wife Anne were sent after people read Communion and began to open up about their experiences. One such experience involved a person who was meeting their biological father for the first time as an adult, a young adult, and they found out that they had had a brother that had since passed on, that they never had the chance to meet. And they were a bit disappointed about that. In the middle of the night, it turns out that suddenly this person who was staying with their biological father, saw this being appear in the middle of the night. And this person was a humanoid, human basically form, led him into the forest and showed him a binder amongst this forest. And he opened up the binder. It was full of pictures of UFOs. Then he went back, went to sleep. Next morning, he woke up and he shared his experience with this strange person, with his father. And his father said, what you're describing is your brother that passed on. So according to this, he was visited by his assumed deceased relative, his brother. And on top of that, his brother led him out and showed him a binder full of pictures of UFOs, hinting that this was key to the whole thing about understanding how he could be there after death, how he could sort of cross that veil, that somehow it was all tied together, which is incredibly perplexing, of course. Another one I want to introduce here in terms of high strangeness is people who've had near-death experiences, which, again, we think of a completely different category, but certainly also call into question some of our assumptions about the nature of reality. You have people who are, for instance, talking to someone they see as a kind of spiritual figure, might be robed or something, walking through a garden. Then they cross in front of a building and look inside and they see a table with beings sitting around this table. And these beings are what we would call gray aliens, the quintessential gray aliens. So what is that doing in a near-death experience? Again, we have this blending together of these categories we would like to keep separate. And as you pointed to, this is one thing Vallée was great about, was saying that we cannot do that. If the data presents in such a way that these things are connected, we must ask ourselves how they are connected. So this also speaks to the high strangeness. And that doesn't even get into the absurdity that people like Bernardo have talked about in his book, Meaning and Absurdity, but it certainly describes some of the bizarre high strangeness people encounter. All right, next quote. Advocates of UAP reality, on the other hand, generally claim that the extraterrestrial hypothesis centered on interstellar travelers from extrasolar systems visiting the Earth is the most likely explanation for the objects and the entities associated with them. This argument, too, can be challenged on the basis of witnesses' own testimony. Ufologists have consistently ignored or minimized reports of seemingly absurd UAP behaviors that contradict the ETH by selectively extracting data that best fits their agenda or version of the ETH. Thus, the ETH, just like the skeptical argument, is based on anthropocentric self-selection. Here we are witnessing an interesting overlap between the SETI and UAP paradigms. Each excludes consideration of the other when laying claim to the legitimate search for and contact with potential non-human intelligence. So in some ways, that's pointing to what we've just discussed. Any additional thoughts on that?
Well, it's a lot of signaling, right? It's sort of like, what have we marked off as the safe places to discuss what this might be? You know, so we're already self-limiting ourselves in the conversation to stake out this territory. And if I keep it in that territory, then that's safe to discuss. It's sort of like if you've gone to therapy or whatever, and you know there are things you need to discuss, but you don't want to go there, so you're going to talk about the other things, and that feels safe for you. But you have to really acknowledge the things you don't want to talk about, because that's where the real work has to happen. And so I see this happening quite a bit, and it's the legacy of the stigma and also just this sort of signaling that we're doing to, with it, taking these two communities as an example, the scientific and the UAP research community, really signaling in a way to each other that this is what we've agreed we can talk about. This is the safe kind of topic where we can maybe have a conversation, but we're going to exclude these other aspects of it because at that point I'm going to lose you. Or you're not going to take me seriously anymore because I'm bringing in, some sort of bizarre dreamlike experience that I had 2 days afterward with a deceased relative.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's really apt that they are again critiquing both different communities and pointing to in that one section how actually they're landing at the same basic way of seeing this entire thing, and that just adds to the bias and adds to the blindness. All right, so now I would like to get to the key section, the real gotcha in this paper, because they, as scientists, then point to ways that we could measure this, examine this, try to demonstrate the validity or the lack of empirical evidence supporting one hypothesis versus another. But what they conclude here is very interesting in terms of what the different hypotheses are and how you would measure them and what kind of tools are available to measure with at present. They said, quote, "Much of the recent progress in cosmological concepts is directly applicable to the UAP problem. Traversable wormholes, three-dimensional hypersurface tunnels, have now been derived from Einstein's general theory of relativity. In particular, it has been shown that Einstein's general theory of relativity does not in any way constrain space-time topology, which allows for wormholes to provide traversable connections between regions within two separate universes or between remote regions and or times within the same universe. Mathematically, it can also be shown that higher dimensional wormholes can provide hypersurface connections between multidimensional spaces. Recent quantum gravity programs have explored this property in superstring theory, along with proposals to theoretically and experimentally examine macroscopic scale extra-dimensional spaces. Thus, it is now widely acknowledged that the nature of our universe is far more complex than observations based on anthropocentric self-selection portend. In this respect, ufologists and SETI researchers appear to be fighting a rearguard battle. Both suffer from identical limitations in the worldview they bring to their own domains and to their antagonism." Now, here we get to the real kicker, though, in terms of how you would demonstrate evidence for one of these hypotheses over another. Quote, "The community of UAP researchers is also driven by its own orthodoxy, which is only violated at great personal risk to the critic who proposes a deviant view, and by its own principle of mediocrity when attempting to categorize and hypothesize explanations for the phenomenon. For this reason, we prefer to use the term UAP rather than the more common UFO, which is immediately associated with the idea of space visitors in the mind of the public and media. Yet a bridge could be formed between the disparate SETI and ufology communities if both would only recognize a simple fact. No experiment can distinguish between phenomena manifested by visiting interstellar, arbitrarily advanced ETI, and intelligent entities that may exist near Earth within a parallel universe or in different dimensions, or who are terrestrial time travelers." Unquote. That's the real kicker. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I've always thought of this too from the standpoint of how would we even know, right? So if an advanced intelligence were to interact with us and say, "Hey, I'm from, this star system over here, and it's a planet. We've got these, sort of things going on." I mean, how would I be able to prove that one way or the other? I think that's sort of touching on this and the fact they're saying, no experiment can distinguish, but between phenomena manifested by visiting interstellar or intelligence that may exist near Earth, right? It could be either one because there's no way for us to verify the truthfulness of the claim without us being able to really travel to that planet on our own steam, by the way. Like if they were to take us in their craft to their planet, how are we to even know that we traveled that distance, that it is in fact another planet like ours across the galaxy. I mean, so there you can see how complicated this problem becomes. It's not to say that it isn't a possible answer. It's certainly I guess the simplest possible answer that you could go with. But if we're talking about advanced intelligence that may be able to kind of like swim laps around our ability to think through this, I mean, you know, how would we be able to kind of judge the truthfulness of any of their claims? You know, and we're really at a disadvantage, in other words.
Right, and just to make clear what they're saying here, and it speaks to what you're talking about, because they are basically trying to build an argument based on our understanding of physics right now and of the universe. And they have pointed out that theoretical physics has postulated that wormholes could be used to make this journey, but that if we were to even capture footage of something that looked like a UFO or a UAP, a spacecraft, coming out of a wormhole, and we say, aha, we know that they're extraterrestrials, Vallée and Davis would say, not so quick, because that could also be a way that interdimensional beings could actually move between parallel universes via wormholes. And also it could be a means of time travel. And this is all part of physics as we understand it right now. It's all based on assuming that we're close to this pinnacle understanding of what's possible out there. And that, of course, should be called into question based on what we're seeing and based on just basic logic, right? Why would we assume that these intelligences that might have been around for so much longer than us, again, even if you go back to cosmological perspectives here in modern science, there's the notion that some parts of the universe have been around for much longer than others and would have been conducive to life having formed billions of years ago. We have talked about how much our civilization has changed, how much our technology has changed, how much we've gone through several scientific revolutions within about a century. What would happen with 1 million or 1 billion additional years? I mean, it gets to the point where it's just impossible for us to even conceive of, which points to what you were saying, where, again, we don't really have any way of knowing this, so we actually really have to rely to some degree on what we're told by these beings. And what's interesting, again, in light of what I said earlier, is that the evidence seems to suggest that, on the one hand, they often do say they are from our relative future, at least some of them, but they will also in the next breath say, but time doesn't exist as you think it does anyway. So, again, we're left on sort of shaky ground. We're left in this place of realizing we are in the midst of a scientific revolution, happening at a time where we are facing all these real challenges in our civilization around who we are and what we will emerge to become in the future. So I think one last piece I would like to add too is that my perspective is that you have to bring in these other phenomena that are points of convergence along with this. And that would be near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, psi phenomena, apparitions, the interaction with supposed dead loved ones like we talked about in that Whitley Strieber letter. I think when you take all of that into consideration, what seems much more likely to me in terms of describing what this is that it's more like a stage set for the evolution of consciousness. And that actually I would argue that while some would look at these beings and say they must have been coming from Earth because they're too much like us, they have the same assumptions as us, they look like us, they seem to be on the same spiritual journey, that we see a spectrum of consciousness amongst them, just like we would amongst ourselves. I think that points to the fact that there is this kind of cosmic seeding program, but underlyingly it's about source itself and these many iterations of different kinds of forms, exploring every permutation of existence, but ultimately at the end of the day, speaking to ancient Eastern cosmologies again, recognizing, waking up to the fact that we are all source. And that's a journey that they are on and that we are on. To me, that's actually the most compelling way at present for me to make sense of this data.
Yeah, and of course I agree with you on that front as well. And what I see in sort of the high strangeness that is exhibited and examples that you just gave as well is a kind of translation issue, like that there are many attempts at communication taking place between them and us, and there are many different means in which that communication is trying to achieve a connection. Sometimes it's symbolic, sometimes it's literal, sometimes it's comfortable, right? It's sort of like, well, we're like this, but we're not quite like this. And if I were to try to explain what we really are, like, you really have no corollary to grasp that right now. So let me give you these sort of stepping stones to get there. So, I think that's what we're seeing take place in these encounters, is that there's kind of a trying to bridge the divide between where the individual experiencer happens to reside in their mental framework of the world, the way they understand everything, and translating between where they reside and where it resides, bridging that gap. And in the process of bridging that gap is absolutely at the very fundamental layer is this evolution of consciousness that is trying to take place. But to get a person from A to B, you really got to go through many steps. It's not just a simple, let me put it out all on the table for you and explain it to you, just like it really is. If I were to do that, it would just be gibberish. Like, it wouldn't make any sense to you. So let's start here, and then we're going to go here, then we're going to go there. Then eventually, over time, we're going to get you closer to what it might be. That, at least to me, has a lot of explanatory power.
Right, and I would finish by saying that, again, this is not just me waxing philosophic. I rely here on my background in integral theory that you pointed out earlier, and I rely on evidence that is provided from something like spiral dynamics. What this has pointed to is that there are predictable ways that humankind evolves, that individuals evolve, but also how entire cultures evolve. That when we go to a certain part of the world and we are able to measure their stage of consciousness, not only can we do that, but we can also, therefore, based on where they are, predict where they are going next. There is this predictable evolution of consciousness, that there is an emergent aspect to consciousness. And now, while some people might say, isn't it anthropocentric to assume that these other beings would go through the same kind of spiral dynamic process? That is what the experiencer data seems to suggest. And it also, again, is backed up by the fact that they do seem humanoid much of the time, and that they do provide messages to us, which, for the first point, we should point out that the fact that they can communicate with us at all and that we can understand says already we have something in common, which I would suggest, again, points to this common background and source consciousness itself. But the point is that they also talk about this progression they have gone through, and that we are in an unfortunate and dangerous point in our history as a civilization where we have forgotten who we truly are, that we have forgotten that we are source consciousness, that we are connected to the planet and connected to this larger cosmic community. And that misunderstanding about who we are is what's presenting our greatest challenges, and perhaps might be the very reason why they are here right now at this point, to try to help us get past this inflection point, which is so daunting.
Well, we certainly could use all the help we can get. So I welcome that, and hope that we can continue to navigate that, the future that is ahead of us. Well, this is, I think, maybe the longest Liminal Frames episode we've recorded, and it's been really a fascinating conversation. I've wanted to dive into that particular paper for some time, so I'm really glad that you brought that up. And I think going through the different hypotheses as well, getting both of our takes on what we liked and didn't like about them, was very rewarding. And I have to say, I continue to evolve in my own perspective on some of these hypotheses, and which may be a little bit more compelling than others. And I think that, to me at least, hints at elements at what Vallée and Davis are getting at here too, and that's that the journey's not finished, right? We still have a lot of work left to do. We haven't arrived on a model that really does satisfactorily explain all of what is happening. I certainly have a strong leaning to the conceptions that you propose, with consciousness being the overarching sort of situation here. But even then, I think that we're going to continue grappling with elements of this as more and more truths and facts and stories become known, and that's a good thing. Like, in time, clarity will be achieved. At least I like to believe it will. And more importantly than that, it's I think it's not just about us landing on the right model per se. It's about how are we living our life, in the context of all that there is around us. It's not just knowing the answer on the test, but how are you living your life? There's a big difference between those two things. You can be incredibly bright, but be really poor to how you treat people, et cetera. So, I don't want to lose sight of that component, because I think that's really so important. It's such a foundational element to all of this. And in modern society and civilization, we've kind of championed knowledge above necessarily like behavior and ethics. And I think that that's a failure of kind of where we've arrived at the moment. So I'm hoping that we can redeem some of those qualities as we move forward and become a more integrated species, both with our knowledge, but also with our wisdom.
Agreed. A good point to end on.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for listening. It's been a real pleasure spending this time with you on this episode, and we look forward to continuing this conversation with you. Please do leave us a comment, a like, and a subscribe. It does help the channel and getting our message out there and growing our audience. And on that note, may the quality of our questions, shaped by a desire for understanding, enhance our journey of discovery. And may our travels broaden the sphere of our consciousness, reminding us that new discoveries beget new horizons. As always, adventure awaits. We'll see you next time on Liminal Frames.